questions. So I'll start now by introducing Ted and Adriane briefly for the first round of talks, and then I'll introduce the rest of the panel later in the afternoon. The Q&A and chat are open at any time, and if folks want to raise a hand, we can also acknowledge questions. We will have a time for questions at the end, so put them in the chat at any point, the chat or the Q&A at any point, and then if you want to raise a hand and ask a question, we'll have time for that at the end. But we'll start with Ted. Ted Siegel is the author of the book that we're so excited about today. He was a graduate in the Duke class of 1977 with a degree in history. He then spent a full career as a corporate attorney, did some very admirable pro bono legal work, and served as the board chair of the Children's Law Center, which is the largest provider of pro bono legal services in the Washington, D.C. area. But then when he retired, he came back to a promise he had made to one of his professors here at Duke to do a deep dive examination of the riots, not the riots, the racial protests at Duke in the 60s, and wrote this wonderful book that is just so beautifully sourced and so thorough and enjoyable to read. So as I said, Ted's going to give a brief synopsis of the book, and then we're going to be joined by Adriane Lentz-Smith, who is an associate professor and associate chair of the Department of History here at Duke. She was recently a fellow at the National Humanities Center, and I think a sentence from that description really sums up her work. She is a scholar of African Americans' entanglements with the U.S. power structure in the long 20th century. I can't think of a better scholar to help us contextualize what Ted was writing about as these young African American students interacted with the power structure here at Duke. So I will hand off to Ted right now, and then later, after Adriane and Ted have a conversation, I will introduce the rest of our panel. So go ahead, Ted.
Nicole, thank you, and thanks to the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences for hosting this event, and for you and your colleagues for pulling it together, and to all the panelists for participating. So Duke was established in 1924, and at the time it had great ambitions and it had lofty aims. President Few, who was president of Trinity College at the time, told Trinity students they would have a part in building one of the great educational institutions in the world. The Duke Charter stated that the university aimed to advance learning in all lines of truth, to develop a Christian love of freedom, to promote a sincere spirit of tolerance, and to render the largest permanent service to the individual, the state, the nation, and the church. But along with these aspirations, Duke embraced the powerful racial codes that defined the Jim Crow South. Duke was segregated. There were no Black students, no Black faculty, no Blacks in university administrative or clerical positions. Duke Chapel, Page Auditorium, Duke Hospital were segregated. Dorms and dining halls, the football stadium, the golf course, all segregated. Fraternities and sororities excluded Black students, as did off-campus facilities where university events were held. So it is accurate to say that from the outset, every aspect of the Duke experience was developed by white people for the benefit of an all-white student body, administration, faculty, and alumni. And at the same time, Duke's predominantly Black non-academic employees operated under what labor organizer Oliver Harvey called a plantation system. Under this system, housekeepers in 1951 were paid 43 cents an hour. By 1959, they were paid 65 cents an hour. And in 1959, a standard 30-hour work week for a housekeeper paid just $19.50, which was below subsistence wages at the time. Duke's non-academic employees had no benefits and worked at the whim of the university. Oliver Harvey said that the workers were treated as subhumans. You worked there 10 and 20 years, and if the supervisor didn't like you, he'd tell you he didn't need you anymore. People were absolutely afraid. I never worked at a place as bad as Duke or as racist. So this was Duke University in the fall of 1963 when the first handful of Black undergraduates arrived on campus. And for the first time, Duke had a small number of Black students as members of the Duke community sharing in the Duke experience. So a key theme of Point of Reckoning looks at how the all-white administration, faculty, and trustees at Duke understood their responsibility to make changes to Duke so that the remarkable Black youngsters who matriculated in 1963 and after could be fully part of the Duke community. Well, as the book narrates, these men, and in 1963, it was almost entirely men that were in leadership positions at Duke, defined their responsibility to these Black youngsters very narrowly. The attitude of many was that by simply admitting these youngsters, the university had done enough. It was up to the students to fit in through what one dean described to me as a natural kind of amalgamation. Black student leader Chuck Hopkins commented that Duke was not ready to have Black students here. They didn't realize that integration meant they had to make some changes too. According to Hopkins, the administration's view was that bringing us to Duke was like bringing the natives into civilization. So Black students entered an institution where none of their culture, history, or communities were represented, and none of their distinctive needs met. So after organizing the Duke Afro-American Society in the spring of 1967, they presented the university with a list of concerns. And the students on their list wanted their historically white institution to make changes so that Duke could be a place where they too could thrive. But Duke was not receptive to making changes. Douglas Knight, who was president of Duke at the time, told me that the university's initial refusal to address the needs of its Black students was due to the deep ambivalence Duke leaders felt about desegregation. According to Knight, many at the university believed that, quote, once we have admitted Blacks, what more do they want? So 6 years into desegregation, Black students saw the university's failure to respond to their concerns as evidence of indifference and bad faith. I guess initially we thought all you had to do was say, look, you overlooked something, student Brenda Brown explained. Well, now they knew they had overlooked a whole lot of things and they still weren't doing anything. It wasn't just a matter of letting people know. Now they know and they ain't gonna do. And Black activism at Duke, including the Allen Building takeover, was an organic response to this failure. So the story in Point of Reckoning is the story of the struggle over what type of institution Duke would be. Would Duke remain a school where the Duke experience was tailored to meet only the needs of white students, administrators, faculty, alumni, and trustees? Or would it become a diverse, inclusive, and equitable institution where everyone could flourish? And how willing was Duke to dismantle the plantation system under which Duke's non-academic employees labored? Ultimately, the question posed in Point of Reckoning is whether Duke rose to the moral challenge posed by desegregation and thus lived up to its lofty aims. That was the issue Duke faced in the 60s, and in many respects remains the central issue it faces today as it undertakes President Price's current anti-racism initiative. So that's my summary of the book.
All right, I'll pop on screen and have a conversation with you about the book. Hi, Ted. Thank you for this book.
Hi, Adriane.
And thanks for being willing to have this conversation. We have talked before, most recently in my civil rights movement lecture class with my undergraduate students. And in that conversation, we talked a lot about student activism, their experience, the experience of Black students on campus in the 60s. But in your overview just now, you kind of gave us a different inflection point, right? You gave us a way of thinking about the book as an institutional history, as a if we talk about sort of top down and bottom up histories. I'm interested in this focus on the top down story, and hoping that you'll say more. And then I'm curious, in thinking about this as an institutional history or as a history of Duke, how much do you see this as being a very Duke specific kind of story? And how much do you see the kind of dilemmas over what desegregation versus actual integration looks like, about diversifying as opposed to kind of suffering admittance? Like, how do you see that story as being generalizable from Duke?
Well, first of all, as to the top-down versus bottom-up question, some of that emphasis in this talk, although not nearly as much in the book, because I really did try to incorporate the voices and the interviews I had with many Black activists from the period. Some of that comes out of my, lived personal experience. I started this work when I was a young man at 22. Put it aside for 40 years and returned to it in 2016. But in that interim period, I worked as a corporate attorney in corporate America in a very, very privileged white world. And so when I returned to this research, I returned sort of with that perspective. And as I began to go through the archival records, what I saw was resonances in some of the Duke administrators to conversations I had had, conversations colleagues had had in my law firm when I was practicing there. And so part of what I've tried to do in the book is not just to describe the bottom up initiatives and demands and concerns of the Black students, but also to shine a light on how the administrators were thinking and reacting, and how they were resisting a change. So in terms of whether Duke is unique or not, I mean, it is true that there are certain unique aspects of Duke. Duke was established in one fell swoop in 1924 with this enormous infusion of funds, and the university kind of rose out of the ground almost overnight. And I think that, coupled with the relationship the university has with the Duke Endowment, or did in the past with the Duke Endowment, gave the leaders of Duke a probably somewhat more corporate perspective on the kinds of demands that were being made of them. The people who ran the endowment were all corporate titans. The people on the Duke board were leaders of the big industries in Durham. And so I think there was a more entrenched attitude at Duke among some of the very most senior leaders. But that said, I think the story is in many respects universal. I'm not an expert on higher education, but I know that many of the same dynamics, many of the same demands were being made in the Black student movement across the country. And the kinds of resistance that was shown at Duke was certainly in evidence in other places. I found, again, a lot of Duke in the historically white institution I worked at for 35 years. I think this is a dilemma that historically white institutions continue to grapple with as they try to give reality to their promises to create a diverse and inclusive work environment.
One of the things that struck me about the book is how many, we talk about the Duke community, or we talk about a community. And one of the things that I really like about the book is the number of players and kinds of players that make up that community. So you give us a rich sense of administrators, faculty, students, folks who work there, folks who live around there, and often, but don't always work there, and how all of the kind of different folks interact, so there's no flattening of
Right.
of the folks involved. And I wonder, does your sense of that community come from having been a student? Does it come from doing oral history? Does it, like, how did you get a sense of what you talk about when you talk about Duke?
Well, some of it was the chance to have conducted extensive oral history interviews with both administrators and students back in the 70s when I first did the work. And then having the chance to revisit those interviews, and in several instances, in the case of Black activists, to re-interview those same people 40 years later to get their perspective. So I had that kind of really very unique 40-year gap between my work. And I think that helped me when I came back to it, think more deeply about who these people were. But in addition, it was really just the historian's good fortune that when I came back 50 years later, all of the archival records from the period had become publicly available. And so unlike in 79, where I had to get Terry Sanford to permit me to look at just a handful of folders, now the Duke archivist made literally everything but privileged and confidential information available to me. And in the case of the administrators, these attitudes, these Jim Crow attitudes, were so accepted and so common that there was absolutely no hesitation putting them in letters, putting them in memos, communicating them. And there was no email, so people communicated through letters. So I had this just tremendous reservoir of information. And then on the student side, even to the point where the campus radio station, WDBS, recorded many of the protests, and those tapes were saved. So I really was, again, blessed by a life experience that primed me to look more deeply, and then just a repository of historical resources. And then the time I was retired to just soak into them and really let the characters in the story kind of come alive in my head and hopefully in the book.
And when you say Jim Crow attitudes, that can mean so many different things, right? Sometimes it's overt racism. Sometimes it's, again, this kind of, we let you in, so what more do you want? And then sometimes it's like these total blinders, right? So I remember being struck by the fact that they were having, I don't remember if they were administrative or faculty events at a segregated country club in town, and not understanding that immediately excluded, so both sent a message and then like logistically excluded various folks from being able to participate.
Yeah, I mean, the story of Hope Valley Country Club, which occupies a full chapter in the book, really is a deep dive into how narrow and really ultimately resistant these administrators and faculty who belonged to Hope Valley Country Club were. There really was a sense that, I'm all for change as long as it doesn't affect me. When desegregation ultimately required, just as you said, self-evidently, that the university would no longer be holding events at a segregated country club where Black students couldn't attend, when that sort of became apparent, they resisted tremendously because they just didn't understand why they had to kind of change their patterns just because a handful of Black students had arrived on campus. And so you're right, it's all different shapes and flavors of these attitudes. There are actors in the story who are overtly racist, and their letters just reek those attitudes. But then the vast majority of actors on the administration side in the story are not people who are writing racist things in their letters to one another. They're people who, in many respects, consider themselves progressive and supportive of civil rights and desegregation, but can't carry that support forward to the extent it requires resources to be allocated or cultural patterns to be changed, like Hope Valley Country Club. It wasn't until 4 years after desegregation, and then only after a year of conflict and ultimately a sit-in by Black students, that the university was finally willing to prohibit campus events at segregated off-campus facilities. It took 4 years and a sit-in before the university could come to that decision.
So speaking of sit-ins, one of the other things that comes through in the book is, which I think has resonance for now, are the ways that the universities seemed to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate forms of protest, or legitimate and illegitimate protesters. Will you say a little bit about that, or your?
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons that studying the history of race at Duke in the 60s is such a rich topic is that you had at Duke in 1968 a predominantly white group of students who launched what became called the Silent Vigil, which was a 2-day occupation of the president's house, followed by a 4-day, 4-night sit-in on the main quad that ultimately reached 1,500 people and basically shut down, for the most part, practically speaking, the university. 10 months later, you had the occupation of the Allen building by Black students who had, feeling that they had exhausted all of the remedies that they could figure as to how to push the university, decided to take this extremely dramatic and dangerous act by occupying parts of the Allen building. And what you see when you put these two events alongside is when white students showed up at Douglas Knight's house as part of a memorial march in honor of the memory of Dr. King, he invited them in. He said, "Come in out of the rain." And all of a sudden, 250 students came in and were occupying his house. Women at that time were required to sign out of their dorms before they could sleep overnight, other than in their dorms. And he actually gave them permission to sign out to his house so they could continue this occupation and not get in trouble with the dorm mother or whoever it was. When the event moved to the quad, the Durham police were called out, but they were called out to protect the white students from reactionary elements that were threatening to, throw bombs or whatever. And then the students were allowed for 4 days to continue their protest. And even though his impulse was to react with force, the chairman of the board was talked out of it and ultimately came and delivered a message, not an acceptable message, but he delivered his message personally to the protesters, and then even joined them all in singing "We Shall Overcome." So if you roll forward 10 months, you have these Black students, none of whom were known personally by the university administrators. One of the dynamics that's so in evidence in the book is that because there was this sense that, well, we've let them in, what more do we need to do? There was no effort made to get to know these kids, to understand their communities, to understand their needs. And as a result, when conflict occurred in 1969, there were no personal relationships that the administrators could call upon to help negotiate out of that very dangerous situation. And so it took Duke administrators 1 hour into the occupation to decide that the Black students would be given a 1 hour ultimatum. And if they didn't leave following that 1 hour ultimatum, the Duke police, the state police, and ultimately National Guard backups were called in, would be brought to campus to remove them using force. And so you just see how the white students were these administrators. In many ways, they could see their sons and daughters in them, but the Black students, because they had never gotten to know them and understand them, really just looked like militants or terrorists, and were treated just much, much more harshly, infinitely more harshly than the white students were. So there was a very, very different perspective brought to Black student protests and white student protests, that's for sure.
And so, 50 years on, or almost 50 years on, Duke started to memorialize these events as part of a kind of narrative of itself and its growing and its progress. And I'm wondering, and when you said you had this 40-year gap where you did oral histories, did you talk to people who viewed their choices differently 40 years after having made them than they did the first time you talked about them, or who reflected back on their past decisions and actions differently? And then also, what do you think of the way that we've come to understand or to talk about on Duke's campus the vigil and the Allen Building takeover?
Well, one comment I would make initially, Adriane, is that phenomenon of sort of creating a narrative around these protests of the 60s had already occurred by 1973, when I arrived as a freshman at Duke. I mean, the narrative had become, yes, Duke had deep racial problems, but these protests occurred. They were a shock to the system. And then Terry Sanford was brought in. And now, things are basically fine. So that was something. I mean, Duke kind of encoded and encapsulated these events with amazing speed, and obviously, in many respects, continues to do it to the present day. My hope is that the book will help humanize and help counter that really comforting narrative that grew up so quickly. It was interesting when I went back and interviewed people. The people I interviewed had been interviewed dozens of times probably about these events. And what I discovered was that their statements and their judgments about the events of the past had become calcified. They had repeated them so often that they had kind of a standard spiel that it was not possible for me to get them off of. What I was able to do, and again, coming back 40 years later, by this point, I had had kids, I had dropped kids off at college, I knew what it felt like to be a parent whose kids are away from home for the first time. And so when I went back to interview these students now in their 70s, I was able to do what I never did earlier, 40 years ago, which was ask them, what were your communities like? What was your high school like? What the heck were your parents saying to you as you were undertaking these protest activities? And that dialogue, which was a new one, really sort of opened up insights into what was going on in the Afro-American society and the Black student movement at Duke that I could have never, ever begun to understand in 1979, because I just wasn't even asking those questions.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I imagine that had that been me, my parents would have simultaneously been proud and killed me, right? Like we didn't make all of these sacrifices, do all of this work for you to go get yourself kicked out of Duke University, to be the
No,
first
I
Black
mean,
child in our community to get kicked out of Duke University.
well, Brenda Brown's mother said, "You've just been watching too many takeovers on TV. Why can't you just get your degree and get out of there without making such a ruckus?" Yeah, no, and each person I re-interviewed told me stories about how terrified and also how opposed family members were at the prospect that these students who were the best and the brightest and carried the hopes and of their communities to this place called Duke University, that they were going to put all of that at risk, not to mention their personal safety. That was very, very hard for parents to come to terms with. Very hard.
Because the very statement of that parent, "You've been watching too many takeovers on TV," reminds you that this is of a moment and in a time where this is part of a broader set of happenings. And it's in a context of a time of deep meanness and murderousness in resistance to people pushing for civil rights change. So it's not abstract danger that these parents feel or are worried about on their children's behalf. It's actually knowing what vigilante or state violence might wreak on them.
Exactly. And what's so interesting and dramatic, there was a figure in the Duke community named Howard Fuller, who was one of the prominent Black Power activists in North Carolina and nationally. And he became connected to the students as a sounding board. And he wasn't dictating what they were doing, but he was a resource they could go to kind of develop their thinking. The administration thought he was a terrorist and that he was pulling the students' strings and was in effect behind the scenes causing all this activism to happen. But when this dramatic moment came, when the students were in the building and the Duke Durham police were marching to the building, armed, tear gas, the students in the building had to make a decision: do we stay or do we go? And it was precisely because Howard Fuller, who had joined them in the building, had such a grounded understanding of what state violence looks like, that he was able to counsel them and say, listen, you cannot be caught in this building behind walls. You'll just be a bunch of dead kids. And with that, the students chose to leave. The irony being that they were all safely back in their dorm rooms because they had wise leadership at the time this big riot occurred on the quad among primarily white students and police. So absolutely, the danger was just so present. But the students, being youngsters, they were not as connected to what could happen. Michael McBride told me we were too young to be afraid. And so thank goodness they had someone in Howard Fuller who was wise enough to be afraid for them.
Yeah. I know that we need to turn to the panel at this point. I just very quickly wondered if writing the book and knowing the history that affected how you read or how you experienced the so-called racial reckoning, the sort of the responses to police violence and injustice that we saw in the summer of 2020 and the reaction to it.
Well, it certainly did, and it particularly did in the sense of bringing me a deeper understanding of what real change would look like if it occurred. I mean, part of what you see in Duke, and I alluded to this, is we'll change, but we're not going to spend any money on it. We'll change as long as it doesn't mean anything personally for me. And so, having worked again in corporate America, I know what it looks like when an institution takes as a priority a problem. They put their best people on it. They invest in remedial solutions. They focus on it every day. They don't let it drop. That's what institutional change requires. It's immensely difficult. And so ultimately, I came away feeling that for Duke to be able, or for any institution to be able to truly say diversity and inclusion is a core value, they need to do more than say that and have diversity training. They need to really re-examine the university's priorities financially and invest in the types of programs that are necessary to create a more diverse and inclusive institution. So yeah, that definitely was something that I did not understand when I was sitting on diversity committees at my law firm, thinking I was doing a great job because I had given up a billable hour to sit and talk about diversity, even though it came to very little. So yeah, that definitely changed my view.
Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, Adriane.
All right, thank you both so much for that wonderful introduction, setting the stage. Has stayed ever since and did his whole career here at Duke. He protested for racial justice in the 60s, was even arrested at one point, interacted with President Knight pretty extensively about encouraging further change. And so we'll dive into that in a few minutes with Dr. Klopfer. We are very fortunate today to have two ambassadors from the Marylou Williams Center for Black Culture, Brianna Johnson and Noah McKee. The Marylou Williams Center was established in 1983 for the purposes of preserving and enhancing Black culture at Duke, promoting harmony among the races and providing a supportive environment for the Black students at Duke. And Brianna and Noah are ABIL ambassadors who work to promote the activities of the center and support the Black students here at Duke. Brianna is a member of the class of 2025 and planning to major in global health and public policy. And Noah is a member of the class of 22, congratulations, planning to majoring in, almost finished majoring in political science and African-American studies. Next, we have Doha Ali, who is one of Duke's young trustees, and she just graduated in 2021 with a BS in economics and a BA in sociology. She was elected in 2021 to be one of the young trustees on Duke's Board of Trustees. Her first year, which she's in now, she serves as an observing member, and then for the next 2 years, she'll be a voting member on the Board of Trustees. And at Duke, she was active in many service roles, including being a member of the Center for Race Relations, the Durham Community Land Trust, and in her hometown of Denver, she serves as a mentor on the College Access Project, involved in getting first-generation low-income students to apply to and succeed in college. So we are so blessed to continue to be able to continue the conversation with Ted and Adriane, and also add these other panelists. So hopefully we have a really full perspective on how things have changed, how Duke has grown over the years. So I would like to start with Noah and Brianna, our youngest members here. There was no Marylou Williams Center, obviously, when this first intrepid group of Black students came to the campus. How does the Marylou Williams Center shape your experience here at Duke?
Well, thank you for having us, first of all. I'm excited for the conversation, and I can get us started. As a senior, besides COVID, I've spent every day of my undergraduate career coming into the center at least once. And one of my friends is sitting over doing work next to me. He nodded and said that is true. So the Lou has absolutely shaped my experience. It's a place that I come to study. It's a place I come to fellowship. It's a place that I come to get exposed to programming and networking, et cetera. So the people that frequent the center, and even the people that just drop in every now and then, have shaped my Duke experience and made it what it has been. It's definitely the main factor that's been at play.
Brianna, what would you add?
I would 100% agree with Noah. I don't have as much experience being that I've only had one full semester here so far, but I've spent every single day so far at the Lou. It's a part of my schedule. I wake up, I go to the Lou, meet, like greet everyone, talk. I do my homework there, and I've met so many of my friends there, including Noah. And the Lou has just given me like an opportunity to feel like I have a family at Duke. I live 9 hours away, so I don't really have like much people like, you know, in the area that I can like feel like I have a home, but the Lou is like my home away from home. And I've had like so many opportunities. Like first semester, I didn't even work there first semester, but I was there so much and they were like, you should work here. And I was like, I should. So yeah, it's pretty cool. And there's just so many opportunities, all the events, it just makes school very enjoyable.
So I assume that the Lou was part of what attracted you to Duke. What else attracted you to come to Duke and then have your hopes been fulfilled now that you've been here?
I actually didn't know about the Lou prior to my application being sent off. I applied early decision as a senior. I applied in a crop of 3 schools. I looked at Duke, UVA. I'm from Northern Virginia, so I was applying for at least one in-state school, and the University of South Carolina, and I ended up applying to Duke early decision. Looking at the competition and the competitive nature of the application process and the program that I wanted to do with political science and AAAS, something along the lines of international relations. My first semester, I changed my perspective major like every week, but Duke had a flexible career program, and that's kind of how I arrived at it. And I would say that being able to be here and work as an ABLE ambassador has been one of my favorite things on campus. And it's been an oasis that I've kind of helped to make for myself, and I try to make available for other students as well. And it's surpassed my expectations as far as what I would be able to do in having a home away from home, just being here specifically.
Mm-hmm. How about you, Brianna? You're a little newer in the process.
I also did not know about the Lou like as I was applying to Duke, but I visited in June. Everything was closed clearly, and people who had visited during the school year told me about it, but I didn't get to see it for myself until the first day of school. But what attracted me to Duke was in like 6th grade, like we were just having a random talk about college for some strange reason in 6th grade. And Duke always seemed like a pretty nice school to me. But as I like got older and actually started looking at colleges, I absolutely loved that they had global health, because everything I did in high school outside of school was public health related. And I'm co-majoring with public policy because I also have interest in like law and stuff for the future. So Duke, the programs, and I loved how diverse the classes were and the academic freedom that you have here compared to like other schools that I was applying to, where they kind of have like your curriculum set up for you freshman year. I really like the academic freedom that Duke gives you and the work hard, play hard, which I feel like everyone needs because we all need a way to de-stress. And yeah, Duke was just, it seemed really cool. I didn't pick Duke because the scholarship I applied to, they like picked me, but I'm glad that they picked me because I love it here.
So it sounds like a combination of the academics that you wanted to major in and then having this really supportive environment is what is making you both seem really happy at Duke. So I'm glad to see that. All right, I'm going to shift now to Doha Ali, our young trustee. In the book, there's so much from the trustees putting pressure on President Knight, saying, you got to get this under control. And some of the even overtly racist statements come from the trustees, particularly about the power dynamics of we must get control over this mess. So obviously there were no young trustees and certainly no young trustees of color back then. What is it like to be on the board of trustees, and is your voice heard?
Firstly, thank you everybody who organized the panel, and thanks for transitioning it online. And special thanks to Ted. I have the book as well. I was hoping to get it signed. We'll have to put that off for the future. But thank you for following through on your promise to your professor, because I have learned so much from the book. On your question, yes, there were no young trustees in the 1960s, and certainly no young trustees that looked like myself. So thankfully, being on the board now, I don't have to be the first person of color, neither the first Muslim on the board. And we know from like the stories of the first Black students on campus, the first individuals in all white spaces have to do so much more than just existing. And I have to carry the weight of transforming the space to be welcoming, not only for themselves, but also for those that come after them. So I've been very lucky to have some board members who did that for us, including William Reuben Cook, who served on the board, Clarence Newsom, who we mentioned in the book as well, and more recently, Trey Walk, who was quoted at the end. He's currently serving with me and serving out his last couple of years. So for me, the service on the board has been really fruitful. You mentioned, Adriane, earlier on that in the book, there was a wide range of stakeholders that we heard from. And so coming to the board, it's been a bit of a transition, because as a student, I, was very much integrated with student life, undergraduate experience, knew what was happening on the ground there. But then my service on the board, I really have to take that wide lens and remember that I'm serving as a fiduciary of the university and not just as a representative for undergraduate students. So it's forced me to kind of go into spaces that I've never been in, like the hospital system, and talk to the nursing staff and hear what they have to say about their time at Duke, and just talk to individuals outside of the student body, which I really know well. And so that has been just great to take a step back. So stepping up on the board requires you to take that step back and to really scrutinize, encourage, and advise, and not necessarily operate. But I would say overall, my perspective has been well received. I think the other board members are good at listening carefully and being able to grasp, process, and react positively, and adjust your thinking quickly to suggestions that they might not have previously considered from their peers. So it's not like, I wouldn't say the hostility that we sense in the book exists now. I think people are understand that Duke is different from what the original founders thought it would be, and that, one thing you need to be mindful of as I exist in that space is just coming from a less well-represented group. I'm disrupting the boardroom by simply being there and being who I am. And so I know that myself and the other board members from these underrepresented minority groups are like in that space, and like I said, are disrupting that space, but we're also being welcomed by our peers. So it's been an interesting experience overall. I think to make change in this role, and especially for me as a young trustee, I only served on the board for 3 years, and like I said, 1 year of serving and 2 actually voting. It's really about observing the behavior of the more tenured peers and trying to still serve as that diverse voice. So I've tried to focus on what role I've been chosen to play and where I think I can add most value.
I was curious to get you to elaborate on, you talked about learning about the fiduciary responsibility that the Board of Trust has for the university. Are there ever times when you feel a tension between your work in advancing diversity and inclusion and then going back to thinking about this fiduciary responsibility? Are they ever in tension, or are you able to find ways to bring those together?
Those into play and where I think I can add most value.
I was curious to get you to elaborate on, you talked about learning about the fiduciary responsibility that the Board of Trust has for the university. Are there ever times when you feel a tension between your work in advancing diversity and inclusion and then going back to thinking about this fiduciary responsibility? Are they ever in tension, or are you able to find ways to bring those together?
Well, there are interesting areas, and like you said, Ted, about creating long and deep engagement and making like actual change towards this anti-racist mission, where we talk as fiduciaries about the university's financial standing. And so what we have to do, like what levers have to be pulled here and there to make sure that the university is in good financial standing. And so it's not necessarily that it's that tension between this anti-racism mission and that, but it's thinking about how can we integrate this mission. So it's not just a mission in which we engage in actions like renaming the Jarvis Residence Hall or renaming and dedicating the sociology psychology building to Wilhelmina Rubin Cook, but it's like, how can we integrate this anti-racist mission that President Price said we're going to transition towards into all factors of the university's mission and the university's actions. And so for me there, it takes a lot of brainstorming, a lot of talking to some more experienced board members and thinking about like, okay, like we said this, but how do we actually live it out and like make it our truth and not just a statement on our website? So it's more kind of pushing, I think, the board in general to think about how we can institutionalize this act of anti-racism into all aspects. And so those are conversations that are taking place right now, and we're working towards it. But I really am hoping that during my time on the board, that I can do some work towards, like I said, institutionalizing this. So it's not just right now we're riding this wave of racial reckoning, and that in a couple of years, it's like, okay, like that happened. We made some statements, we made a website, we had a couple of panels, and that's it. But make sure that it's an actual commitment that will push us into the next 100 years of Duke, because we're celebrating our centennial in 2024. So just thinking about where do we want to be when we celebrate later on how far Duke has come.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate your service to all of us as someone who plans to keep working here for the next several years, even after you guys graduate. Dr. Klopfer, I want to turn to you now. You were here at Duke in the 70s and you actively engaged with President Knight. Can you tell us a little bit more about your interaction with him and what some of the pressures that he was under and that you were feeling as a progressive person on campus here?
Well, that was a long time ago. And yes, Douglas Knight and I had become pretty good friends. We did have some background similarities, having both had an affiliation with Yale. And we became fairly good friends. But I was struck by the fact that he was clearly without any experience in the world of minorities. I grew up in a mixed society. So from my earliest days, I was interacting with people who didn't look like me. And often I was the minority member of a group. So I had some empathy for what the first group of Black students were going through when they came to this segregated institution. But Knight was totally without any sense of what that experience meant. And in our discussions about Duke's policies with respect specifically to the admission of the first group of Black students, was totally without any kind of affect. He simply could not imagine that there was any particular problem. And when students who'd previously been excluded were suddenly told, well, yeah, we're willing to consider your admission. And I was really puzzled by his total inability to put himself in the place of these others. He was, however, a really very decent man. Of all of Duke's presidents, and I got to know most of them fairly well, he was the one I most respected and liked. Well, I shouldn't say most respected. I have to say I had enormous respect for Terry Sanford, although the two of us were at odds more often than not. But I really liked Douglas Knight and was sorry when he left, although I have to say as an administrator, largely for his inability to empathize was a failure.
Mhm. I think you hit on what Ted was getting at, that there were some things that the white progressives just didn't understand. And I think you say it was they had no way to understand what was going on with students.
Yeah, he simply could not put himself in the position of these students whom we are now admitting.
Mm-hmm. And yet was also unable to stand up to the board of trustees and the very, very racist alumni who were sending such ugly messages. He was really caught in the middle. What was the reaction of other professors on campus? I'll give the spoiler alert for the end of the book when there was a disciplinary hearing and all of the Black students came together and said, you're going to put us all on trial. We're not going to say that only a certain subset of the community is on trial. And the university said, all right, we're going to give you all a reprimand. It was rather slap on the wrist. What was the reaction of other professors when that happened?
Well, it was divided. Of course, my position had been well advertised, so I didn't have much personal contact with those who opposed it. Mostly I heard from those who agreed with me. So I can't begin to estimate how the faculty divided on this issue. But certainly there were a great many who felt punitive action should have been taken, just as there were others who were relieved that the matter was resolved as quickly and quietly as it was.
I guess not surprising. Just as many opinions as there are today. Thank you so much for your work.
There certainly were a substantial number of very racist faculty members, even in my own department, which was one of the most supportive of integration of any of the departments. I think zoology in those days, we were a divided institution then. Zoology and psychology, I think, had the largest number of professors who were involved in assisting the students who were involved in the sitting movement. But for example, shortly after I arrived at Duke, that was in '58, a senior member of my department cornered me in the staircase one day and said, you know, if you don't like our customs, you ought to go back to Cambridge now rather than later. That
Wow.
was a senior member of my department.
Wow. Well, thank you for your courage in staying here and standing up to that. I want to shift now to.
I had planned to go back to Cambridge in '62, but then circumstances prevented my leaving the country. So I'm still here.
Well, thanks, Tiffany, then. Thank you.
Nicole,
So I want to turn now
just,
to Dr.
I'm sorry?
I was going to ask if I could just jump in and make one very quick comment.
Please, yes.
Yeah, no, I think Peter's characterization of Knight, based on my research, obviously I interviewed him, but I didn't know him, is exactly correct. And I think it emanated from how he viewed kind of what a university was supposed to be. He did not see, because he had this very detached view of racial issues, he did not see, racial justice as a core value of the institution, even though he would sort of say he did from time to time. You could see, just as Peter described, this very detached perspective he brought. But other aspects of the university that he did see as core, one of them being academic freedom, for example, having controversial speakers on campus, he really was able and willing to go to the mat to defend the right of people with unpopular views to speak on campus. And I think that's because, unlike issues of racial justice, he saw academic freedom as at the core of what the university is all about, and was willing to defend that, but was never willing to invest his political capital or standing in racial issues.
That seems that fits with everything we've seen. So I want to shift now to Dr. Adriane Lentz-Smith. There's so much in the book, so many examples in the book where we have this very entrenched power structure. So the university, we have the professors who are supposed to be teaching, and the students are supposed to be learning, and the board of trustees is making these rules, so we have these power structures that are coming against these students, these very young students, but with ideas that are widespread in society. So how do you, looking back all these years, evaluate that relationship between the very entrenched power structure and the racial dynamics? How do you place that in context?
Well, I think we can place it in context in a few ways. One is to talk about kind of, like millennials and Gen Zs tend to talk about boomers derisively these days, but to go back and look at this as this kind of moment of a population boom in which kind of people who are emerging as adults are coming to understand that they have a capacity to affect power structures, right? That it's sort of like, the board of trustees are this big ambient strong thing, but they're not the only power at play. And so this is partially about a generational assertion of their capacity to shape the world in the way that they want it to be shaped. And so I think that's one way to contextualize it. Another one is to think about the ways in which the university is changing in this period, right? That's still kind of, I guess the late 60s is kind of late to call the post-war university, but on some level, this question of what is a university for, which we still ask and which many people have different answers for, was an active question in the 1960s as well. So if on some level we see it as educating people for global citizenship, the question of what that meant, or citizenship sort of broadly speaking, and sort of who had access to it and what it would look like that's all happening there too. As an aside, I'm going to say this to Noah because I wrote it down, that at some point you said you were changing your mind about what to major in every week. That's a sign that you were getting a good education. Because if you come into a university and think you're going to do one thing and leave doing exactly the same thing, then what was the point in which you grew or discovered some parts of yourself or discovered some parts of your brain? So that doesn't have anything to do with your question, Nicole, but I think it's important to flag. I did an interview at CNN right after I graduated that turned into a therapy session. And I said to the woman in there, I felt like I was so much more certain going into college than I was coming out of college. And she said, congratulations, you benefited from a good liberal arts education. And so I think that one of the ways in which I would contextualize this is to say that what we see is the kind of empowering results of a good liberal arts education, which means to be that wherever faculty stood on these questions of who should be there or who they wanted to be teaching or how they wanted to be teaching, they were offering students tools that they didn't even know that they were offering them all of the time, and that students used, again, to kind of push for the institution, and from that institution, the world that they thought they should have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think one of the topics that comes up in our Inclusion Power Dynamics workshop series all the time is how do you find power when you're in a low authority situation? And the university was telling the students, well, if you want to make change, you need to be on a committee and you need to come to these meetings, and nothing came of the committees. Do you think they effectively used the low power strategies that were available at the time?
I think so. And, and I'll say, I hate committee meetings, but in defense of committee meetings, there is a way in which the way that institutions structure themselves, there is a logic for getting things done that gets a lot of stuff done, right? The day-to-day work pretty much functions that way. but sometimes the things that need to get done aren't getting done within those structures. And when people come with different ideas for how to like be effective, then there ought to be sort of venues for them to be heard. And when there aren't venues, then people will create those venues, right? And in this late 60s moment, when those committees or sort of ways of practices could have been venues to allow students to be heard, but were being used instead as ways to block them out, then what students did, and their allies and the people who were working with them, were to take those lessons of the kind of broader civil rights movement, things they learned from Howard Fuller and that Howard Fuller learned from working with others about how power isn't just sort of vertical, but what's the horizontal, that it happens this way, and that when people join together, it is something bigger, it produces something greater than the sum of its parts. They were taking the social movement's lessons of the period and applying them to the institution that most immediately kind of shaped their experience and their lives. And so good on them. Mm-hmm. I'll also say, I'm babbling, I've had a lot of coffee. I will also say though, that it was really delightful to hear the students talk when they were saying like, what is your experience of Duke now? And your answers were about your intellectual engagement and your energy, which is a sign that you have the energy to do that you aren't spending all of your time just trying to open up a little wedge in which you can exist. And I don't doubt that happens sometimes, but it's nice that it's not the sort of like totality of your experience, that you could lead with what you're learning and how you're learning to be a student and a friend and an adult. So yay.
Thank you. Yeah, so before we open up to the audience for questions, I want to open it up to this panel. Are there anything that you guys haven't shared yet? Any advice for members of the audience? We've talked about how far Duke has come. What would you say now to how does Duke need to continue to work? What can we in the audience continue to do to support creating a truly inclusive, diverse university? And anyone just pipe up if you have an idea.
I think one thing that the book does really well is it helps create an institutional memory of the university. And I think that is really helpful for student activism and grassroots movements. I've been a part of a couple in my when I was in undergrad, and I would say that like the university really benefits from the fact that students turn over every 4 years, and with that, the passing of institutional memory with those students who leave. So when students have like so little time on campus each year with the breaks, current campaigns are usually given more priority over the collection and preservation of like the institutional knowledge. So I think for students or anybody engaging in activism on campus, even though it might be like an afterthought, I think doing the work of just trying to preserve the knowledge, whether that be through the digital age of creating Google Drives or such, and working with the individuals in the Rubenstein Library who actually want this knowledge archived. And so I think we're doing ourselves a disservice of organizing without benefiting from the knowledge and strategies of the past members of the community. So it's just really creating a place for that information to live. That's really crucial. And for creating a sustainable movement, so decentralizing leadership and management structures, creating strategic partnerships where, work with student government or try to make it an actual club that has funding and is chartered. I think that's something that I would tell the new crop of students that arrive, that you don't have to start from scratch. They can read The Point of Reckoning, they can talk to former alumni, but really to try to build that institutional knowledge. I think the BSA does a really good job of that, along with the Marylou. I attended a couple of events throughout my time in undergrad that were focused on bringing back alumni and hearing the stories of those who've done some work on campus.
I'd also chime in and say, put in a plug for Valerie Gillespie, the university archivist, who's amazing, and the resources of the university archives. And you mentioned Rubenstein as a site and a resource. There are places to go at Duke to learn about Duke that also need you to keep adding to the primary source material. I love that Ted's book exists in part because William Chafe was like, hey, why don't you make sure that you finish that sometime, right? A history professor. Also, just as a sort of larger point about institutions, as we know, like institutions are dynamic, student populations turn over, people come and go, and yet somehow there is a thing that is the institution that remains. And so we're always creating an institutional culture, we're always setting its priorities, we're always making it be the thing that we want it to be. There's no assumption that there will be progress. Oftentimes there's sort of backtracking. There's no assumption that progress made is progress that stays. And so we're constantly creating a viable and fair and joyous place. And that's work that's required of everyone that sort of comes to it. And so reminding the institution of what we want that to look like and what's required, not just of them, but of the other people who make up that space is vital.
I think embedded in what you're both saying is for a lot of us in the audience who are faculty and staff who are not turning over every 4 years, keep that institutional memory alive and keep the progress in the direction where we want it to go. Keep welcoming those new students and keep making them feel safe, I hope. Noah, I see you unmuted.
And I want to note we talked about it briefly earlier in discussing some of the content of the book, the atmosphere on campus when Duke was desegregating, while it was segregated, et cetera. A lot of the critical roles, the vital work that's done on campus being done by Black folks from Durham, and the reference of Duke as the plantation back then. If we look around and we want to talk about points of reckoning and continuing conversations, nobody that looks like that or holds that job is on this panel right now. And there are people that have worked at Duke for 50 plus years, people who have worked at Duke for 5 years, who I'm not in a position to say that they would say that it's still one of the worst jobs that they've had, but nobody knows because we haven't asked them. They're not, well, not nobody hasn't asked them, but we haven't asked them just now. So that's one of those things that's a resource that we need to tap into without a doubt to get a feel for what campus life is like for the people who aren't necessarily as lucky as Brianna or myself, as Dr. Lentz-Smith said, to spend like every moment of our undergraduate career trying to carve out a piece of something. We've had people who came before us that carved out a lot for us. And while we're still trying to carve more, there are people who haven't had such luck because there's still labor unions getting shot down. So that's just in brief.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
I think Noah's point is extremely astute. And if there was one challenge and disappointment, frankly, in working on the book, is that the historical records that I had access to of the workers were sparse to the point of being non-existent. Some of that may well have been that the workers lived in such fear of retribution that kind of making their views known was not something that was possible or without consequence. But what Noah is describing, certainly began in the period that I studied, and as he said, it continues today. So it's really a great point.
So maybe another takeaway is for those of us who have this privilege to use it in a positive way, for those who don't have the privilege, for those who can't risk their livelihood because it's meager to begin with, can't risk their livelihood by protesting.
I think this is happening, but if it's not, it would be a good idea. But a Black workers or a Duke workers oral history project is a really fantastic way to actually begin to pull things into the light.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating.
Sorry. When you all were discussing the book, Noah mentioned it, the plantation worker aspect that Duke had the reputation of. And then when Doha was talking, she mentioned how Duke's mission statement, like there's a bunch of diversity and inclusion sparks throughout the mission statement, but we have to actually execute. When I got here and my first time going to Marketplace on the second day of school, I looked around and I noticed that every worker in Marketplace was Black. But then when I go to the broader campus community with like my professors and all the advisors, I noticed that it cannot be said for the faculty the same way the staff is all Black mostly. And that was like a shock to me because I come from I'm from New York. So when I go in like places where it's like high positions, there's like a lot of diversity. And when I applied to Duke, I noticed that diversity was something that they really like push like in their mission statement all over the website, but seeing the lack of diversity in staff was kind of strange to me. And in my African American Studies class, I took race and ethnic minorities with Professor Candace Watts Smith. She is in the political science department, and she was telling us how when she attended Duke, I don't know what year she attended, but when she attended Duke, there were only 2 Black people in her department. And once she started working here, she's only the 3rd now. The 2 people that were her professors are still working here, but she's been the only addition to the department since she was a student here. So I know that Duke is always trying to do the best they can to promote diversity and inclusion, but it gets to the point where I feel like if we're going to keep promoting something, there has to be a way for it to actually be executed. Because when she said that, it really like opened my eyes, like, wow, we have all of these diversity and inclusion statements, but what are we really doing to actually contribute to the change if the faculty, which is a major part of the university, and what happens and the higher level people who work like in those positions, they have the power to facilitate much of the change. So I think there needs to be an addition to the diversity and inclusion statement to include the faculty, not just like the students, because the faculty and the people in the higher level positions, they have like the power to make the change that we really want to see. And of course we have the power as well, but like the real power comes from them. So.
Yeah, and there's a question that just popped up in the chat that launches right off of that. And I'm actually going to direct this one to Doha because you talked about the fiduciary responsibility. Ann Yoder asks in the Q&A, what will it take to get Duke to put substantial financial resources into the issue of faculty diversity? For example, I've observed numerous other universities are creating postdoctoral fellowships in the sciences for persons of color with the ambition of transitioning to faculty. What do you say to that, Doha?
To that, I will say that I know the university is taking steps. And so there's been, like I said, there's been a lot of talk. We talked about the anti-racism mission that President Price has talked about and sent out that email and created the whole series about there. I think they've started in our meetings, at least from what I've heard from past trustees, that, you know, now every meeting we come in here from Kimberly Hewitt, who gives us the DEI numbers on like the faculty. So they're taking actually a deeper dive look to see like what are our numbers saying, what story is this telling, and something that I've heard in the board of trustee meetings that I've attended and from my peers, they've said that like that wasn't always the case where we like that was something that was highlighted. It was more like that was an afterthought unless somebody asked a question like, hey, can you bring that? It wasn't something that like they brought to the whole board. So I am encouraged by the fact that like this is something that we're actually discussing. And I know that the President Price added a program of creating a fellowship of like a presidential fellow. And that's not necessarily in the terms of faculty, but I think it's towards pushing more people of color of diverse backgrounds into administrative positions that hold some power. And so we're trying to get those individuals who are in the faculty to get on that track to getting into the admin. But I think overall what it is it's going to come down to kind of pressure from alumni, pressure from students to be like, we want more individuals of color. But like you said, it is financial. I know there's a number of alumni who have donated and who have donated with the clause that this money is to go towards the hiring of more diverse faculty. But I think there's a long ways to go, and that it is definitely a conversation being had at the higher level. I can tell you that. But when it comes to finances, Duke, like many other institutions, is a slow moving bureaucracy, and to get money moved from one pot to another takes a lot of discussion, a lot of time, and we just need to keep holding Duke accountable and putting the pressure on them to move this quickly, because the way things work, I have learned in my few months on the board, is that things take years to happen. And so when the pressure is on them, they speed it up a little bit more.
It's also the case that Duke there was a university-wide postdoctoral fellowship program that was a pipeline program that was designed to move people from postdocs onto faculty. And I don't know that it exists in the same form anymore. As we were saying, Duke is one institution with many different parts. So part of the idea was that departments had to be proactive about pushing for those moves, getting those postdocs and making that transition. And I'm not sure that that happened. So there's also the question of how you get sort of the smaller parts to sign on to the vision of the whole. And then there've been other initiatives. I mean, there's a faculty hiring initiative now to some extent that is in designed and intended to diversify the faculty. But as with students, the question of bringing people in, like you don't just bring people in and you're done. There's mentoring, there's support, there's understanding the service burdens that are on faculty. There's doing this pipeline work at the graduate student level at a moment when universities are often reducing the numbers of graduate students because the job market is not, great. And so there are many factors that are then cutting against the very moves that we're asking them to make. And I do think, as Doha flags, that a lot of this is about convincing people that putting resources towards diversification at every level is money well spent, right? That you're not somehow doing it at the expense of the broader life of the university. You're doing it for the benefit of the broader life of the university.
Yeah, Roxanne puts in the chat, for the sciences, from the Provost Office and the Office of Faculty Advancement, money is available for Black postdocs. I'm not sure how consistent this is, and it's certainly not broad enough. But so as you were saying earlier, Adriane, the university is a very slow-moving beast, and sounds like we are moving. But I agree with Doha that we need to keep the pressure on, keep holding the accountability. Ted, I wonder if you could give some insight from your experience in the corporate world. You talked about when a corporation wants to make change, they're working on it every day. How does that need to look at the university?
There are, two things are true simultaneously. One is that at the highest levels, as that Doha is talking to us about, there really does need to be a level of commitment where the people with the greatest power are being freed up to spend significant time on these initiatives that the university cares or says it cares so deeply about, or will know it cares so deeply about when we see the types of resources, both human resources as to who's working the problem and how, and financial resources in terms of what is being invested in. That's when we'll know the university is or we'll see most tangibly that the university is committed to this work. But the other point that Adriane makes, and the other challenge with universities, is that they're just so highly decentralized, and even when you get buy-in at the board of trustee level, you don't necessarily have buy-in at the departmental level where hiring begins. And when Terry Sanford came in, he tried absolutely everything he possibly could to promote diverse hiring in the faculty, and absolutely nothing came of it. And after 5 years, he finally funded in each department a certain number of slots that could be used for diverse applicants. And even then, there was pushback. So it's a very, very hard problem, but you need to somehow mobilize the highest levels, but also work culturally and otherwise on the departments to continue to follow the direction the university is in.
And piggybacking from that, I want to read what Allison Adcock put in the chat, which is that the work of inclusion and diversity, much like the work of intellectual freedom, is absolutely required for us to achieve our academic potential as an institution. If we want to be asking the right research questions, learning about the right topics, we have to be inclusive of everyone and thinking about things in innovative ways. It's absolutely necessary. So I'm going to, in just a moment, I want to give Dr. Klopfer the last word. First of all, I want to thank the Office of Faculty Advancement for their co-funding of this series. I want to thank the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, my colleagues on the Inclusion and Power Dynamics Planning panel, which are Katie Dickerson, Marcy Oyenoyama, and Colleen Bauer. And Colleen, especially, I want to thank her for managing the logistics of the event today and sending out all of the emails and reminders and getting everyone organized so well today. I want to thank all the panelists. And Dr. Klopfer, I just want you to end by telling us, what have we learned, and what would be your parting words to all of us in the audience who really want to continue the work that you started with your protests back in the 60s?
I think the answer to that has already been voiced by others before me, namely that it starts at the level of the department. If the students of color are not comfortable working in the labs of our department, they're not going to apply to graduate school. If the graduate students of color are not comfortable working in our institution, they're not going to apply for faculty positions. If the faculty of the departments don't make a concerted effort to search for new applicants apart from the contacts they have with their friends in other predominantly white institutions, we're not going to make any progress in recruiting a more diverse faculty. So I think the initiative that Terry Sanford took years ago needs to be repeated, it needs to be amplified, it needs to be hammered home to individual faculty that if they don't move, Duke isn't going to change beyond the degree to which it already has.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists, especially Brianna and Noah for taking time out of your classes today in Doha, for coming in from across the country. Dr. Lentz-Smith, we really appreciate your insight. Dr. Klopfer and Ted, thank you for writing this book. So thanks to everyone and have a great afternoon.